Hi, and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Margaret Plantagenet Pole. I am going to start out this podcast a little differently than normal by admitting to something that just happened that was super embarrassing. It's going to be my birthday soon, and this will be coming out after my birthday, so it's already been my birthday when you're listening to this. But for me, it's about to be my birthday, and I got a birthday present of a new microphone, and I just recorded this entire podcast, the entire thing. And then I realized that my mic had been on mute since about 5 minutes in. The mute button has a red light, but the red light is on the opposite side of the mic as I am, so I couldn't see it. I should do my podcast in front of a mirror maybe, but I am now going to record it for a second time. So it should be good because I already did this once before. Margaret Plantagenet was born in 1473, the only surviving daughter of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, and his wife, Isabel Neville, who was the eldest daughter of Richard Neville, the Kingmaker, and who has her own episode with her sister, Isabel and Anne Neville. You can go check it out. Her maternal grandfather was killed fighting against her uncle, King Edward IV, at the Battle of Barnet. Her father, already Duke of Clarence, was then created Earl of Salisbury and of Warwick because his father-in-law was a traitor to the crown. So, since his brother was the king now, he got all of his father-in-law's lands. Margaret Pole's life can best be summed up by trying to survive while surrounded by traitors to the crown. She was constantly trying to live from treason to treason. She was just survive in between the treasons. Her father, George, had been his brother's spare when they were younger, next in line to the throne, but his older brother, the king, married a Lancastrian woman. If you need a refresher on that, you can find it in Elizabeth Woodville's episode. King Edward and Elizabeth Woodville had 10 surviving children. So by the time of Margaret's birth, her father had been displaced as the spare many times over. 2 years after Margaret's birth, her parents had a little boy named Edward, because there were Edwards everywhere. The king was named Edward, so everyone had a baby named Edward. Margaret's mother died when Margaret was just 3. Her father had 2 servants killed when he thought they had poisoned her. Without a trial, of course, because servants did not get trials. Trials were for people with money and status. Later, he accused his sister-in-law, Queen Elizabeth, of using witchcraft to kill his wife. The reality was that Isabel probably died of childbed fever. It was just about a month or 2 after she had a baby, or tuberculosis, which was also going around. Her father's mental health had been rapidly deteriorating for a couple of years now. He was ambitious and jealous of his brother, the king, the middle of the 3 surviving York brothers. And he resented his brother's wife, the queen, on a whole other level. They had mad beef. Again, listen to Elizabeth Woodville's episode to understand George's hatred for her. Margaret's father, George, plotted against King Edward IV, his brother. He was getting increasingly paranoid. George was then imprisoned in the Tower of London by his brother, the king, and put on trial for treason against his older brother, King Edward IV. George was not present, and King Edward himself prosecuted his brother and demanded that Parliament pass a bill of attainder against his brother, declaring that he was guilty of unnatural, loathy treasons, which were aggravated by the fact that George was his brother, who, if anyone did, owed him loyalty and love. Following the conviction and attainder, he was privately executed at the Tower on the 18th of February, 1478. Soon after the event, a rumor spread that he had been drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, his favorite drink. This could have been just a joke by his brother, the king, for him to be drowned in his favorite wine. A reason for Edward to have his brother executed may have been that George threatened to question the legality of the royal marriage. He may have discovered from Bishop Robert Stillington of Bath and Wells that George had probably let slip the secret of the pre-contract for Edward's marriage with Lady Eleanor Talbot. Who is Lady Eleanor Talbot? We don't know. But the rumor is she was engaged to the king before his wife was, and engaged legally enough that it was a contract and you couldn't break it, meaning his other marriage wouldn't have been legal. Though a lot of people dispute it. It's kind of such a little brother thing to do, like spread a rumor about his older brother. But in this case, it was treason. In February 1478, George was attainted and executed for treason. Being attainted meant that what you did was so bad that your titles and lands were forfeit to the crown, not to pass on to your children, and you didn't get a trial for that. If you got convicted or didn't get convicted, the king could just be like, and detained. Your stuff is mine. His lands and titles were thereby forfeited. George was killed 1 week before his son Edward turned 3, and he was buried on his son's 3rd birthday. Traitor number 1 in Margaret's life. Her father, George. Now orphans, Margaret 5 and her little brother Edward 3 went to live with their Aunt Anne and Uncle Richard, who also had a son named Edward, who was 2 years old. Their Uncle Richard was the younger brother of their father, George, and their Aunt Anne was the younger sister of their mother, Isabel. So they were aunt and uncle on both sides. Her other uncle, King Edward IV, died 5 years later in 1483 when Margaret was just 10 years old. The king is dead. Long live the king. His son became the new King Edward V at 12 years old, and he was kept in the Tower for his safety. Safety is in heavy air quotes because he and his brother ended up not being at all safe, probably at the hands of their Uncle Richard, who was keeping them in the Tower for their safety. The following year, the late king's marriage was declared invalid, making his children illegitimate. Margaret and her brother Edward were barred from the throne by their father's attainder, though Parliament could have reversed the charges if they wanted to, but they didn't want to. And they offered the crown to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, their uncle, the brother of the last king. The king is not dead, just imprisoned and missing, but long live the king. It seems shady to declare the current king illegitimate during his own reign. He obviously had nothing to do with it. This was probably a Richard thing. He was like, oh, by the way, I heard from my brother that my other brother had a girlfriend before he had a wife, so they weren't really married, so I guess you're going to have to find a new king. Oops, who's it going to be? I guess me. I mean, come on. If we were to put it in modern day terms, it would be like if William became king when his children were still children and then died. Then Harry was put in charge of making sure William's kids were okay and on the throne. Like, you're the transition guy. Get my kid on the throne. So then Harry said, well, Wills and Kate were never legally married because he was married to someone else before that. So none of his kids can be king or queen. So I guess I'm the king. Oops, my bad. And then Will's kids came up missing. And that is why Richard III is almost always seen as a villain. Almost always. Almost never is. They're like, Richard III was a good guy. That's not something people usually say. Over the next 2 years, the Yorks had some pretty awful luck. First, Margaret's cousin Edward, the only son of the king and queen, died at the age of 7, while his parents were in Nottingham on their way to visit him. Both Richard and Anne were overwhelmed with grief at this news. We don't know what he died of, but the king and queen were left without an heir, and they were devastated at the loss of their only child. They were raising George's son Edward and his sister Margaret, but This uncle's claim to the throne had only been because George's children had been barred from ruling when their father was attainted and executed. And his only other brother's children, he declared illegitimate, removing them from the line of succession, making him, he was the youngest brother. So all of those kids in his family had to be declared not eligible to rule before he would have a chance. And now he had no one to rule after him. And rude. Your brother trusted you with his children. And you do this. I don't know. I mean, maybe he's innocent. He was the king, though, so it seems like he should have done a better job when he was Lord Protector. His wife, Anne, was still in her 20s, so she could have more children in theory, but she hadn't in the last 7 years. So there were questions about if she could. She may have had an injury that was stopping her from getting pregnant because she had gone 7 years since the birth of her son without another pregnancy. But she too died less than a year later from consumption, or as we call it now, tuberculosis. For the second time in her life, Margaret lost her mother figure. First, her mother Isabel when she was 3.5, then her mother's sister, her Aunt Anne, when she was only 12. King Richard's enemies claimed this was proof of God turning against King Richard for the part he played in the disappearance of his nephews, the princes in the Tower. People were unhappy, and the king had no wife or children left surviving. The king was in a very vulnerable position. There was also rumors that he had been having an inappropriate relationship with his niece Elizabeth. The rumors were that he was hoping to replace his wife with his niece. He had been showing massive favoritism to his eldest niece, who he had legally declared illegitimate. He had bought her matching clothing with his wife, the queen. They had showed up to court, like the queen and the other queen, dressed in matching clothing. But Richard had denied this, and he did seem very brokenhearted over the loss of his wife. There was an uprising, and Henry Tudor, also seeing that Richard was vulnerable, was on his way to attempt to depose the unpopular king. Henry Tudor had a claim to the throne. Probably not as good as Richard, but nobody liked Richard, so he had a shot. Richard III sent Margaret and her brother off to Sheriff Hutton Castle in Yorkshire for safety, while he fought Henry Tudor for the throne. The winner of this battle would become the King of England. In 1485, King Richard III was defeated and killed at the Battle of Bosworth by Henry Tudor, who succeeded him as the next king. The king is dead. Long live the king. Henry Tudor became King Henry VII. The second traitor in Margaret's life, King Richard, her uncle. The question is, was he a traitor when his nephews went missing, or when he was killed by Henry Tudor? To me, it seems likely that it was both. And as had happened before, she lost her second father figure, her father George when she was 5, and her uncle Richard when she was 13. If she remembered the passing of her parents at 3 and 5, the passing of her aunt and uncle at 11 and 13 would have felt like a repeat of that traumatic childhood experience. They were orphans for the second time in their life. The new king married Margaret's cousin, Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter. But there was a bit of a delay because Richard had declared her illegitimate, and Henry had to reverse that in order to make her an appropriate wife. He did, and then he married her. Margaret and her brother were taken into their care. At this time, they were 13 and 10, respectively. As young Edward was a potential York claimant to the throne, he was soon moved to the Tower of London. He was also only 10 still. I don't really like kids in prison. He was put in the royal apartment part of the Tower. He was still the nephew of the former King of England and the younger cousin of the current Queen. But he was a little boy who was in prison, no matter how nice the prison was. He was still a little boy who had lost both of his parents when he was young, so young he may not have even remembered them, and then lost his second set of parents, his aunt and uncle. And we shouldn't forget that this this little boy's cousins were also put in this very same tower at 12 and 10 by the last king, and they came up missing and probably dead. So there were no assurances of safety in this tower. His cousin had been the king, and he went missing. It was because of this very situation that a boy was brought to the Irish lords named Lambert Simnel. He shared an uncanny resemblance to the old King Edward, the current queen's father. They claimed he was Edward Plantagenet, Margaret's brother. He was likely a common boy that had been trained in courtly behavior. This little boy likely had no idea how much danger he was putting himself in by going along with this plot. But he was also just a child and likely had very little choice. Simnel's advisors thought that King Henry had followed in King Richard's footsteps and put his rival to death, but he hadn't, either because he thought he may need him later, or because he was the loved cousin of the Queen who had already lost her younger brothers in a similar way. King Henry had kept Edward alive. Edward was briefly displayed in public at St. Paul's Cathedral in 1487, in response to the presentation of the impostor Lambert Simnel as the Earl of Warwick to the Irish lords. He was 12 years old, and this was the first time he was out of the tower that we know about since he was 10 years old. Shortly after that, probably in November 1487, Henry VII gave Margaret in marriage to Sir Richard Pole, King Henry's cousin. The 14-year-old Margaret, cousin of the Queen, was now married to the 25-year-old Richard, cousin of the King. It seems fairly obvious that this marriage, like the marriage of the King and Queen, was meant to unite the House of York with the House of Tudor. Margaret would have had very little choice in the marriage. She likely wasn't even asked, just told. Lambert Simnel was given life in prison. More babies in jail. But King Henry VII showed some mercy. It was kind of unlike him. King Henry pardoned young Simnel, probably because he recognized that Simnel had been merely a puppet in the hands of adults, and put him to work in the royal kitchen as a spit turner. And when he grew older, he became a falconer. I know that came out of nowhere. We aren't used to kings showing mercy, but we also aren't used to being in the Renaissance instead of the Middle Ages. So maybe this could be a gentler world. Margaret and her husband had a baby 5 years into their marriage when they were 19 and 30, which makes me feel a little better about the young marriage if they waited till they were adults to have babies. Hopefully they waited for a lot of things. It was a little boy that they named Henry, clearly pandering to King Henry. They were signaling with this name that they were loyal Tudors. They hadn't named him Edward or George or Richard, because that would have been signaling Yorkist loyalty, and that wasn't a safe thing to do. Naming your baby Edward was now way out of style. The new fad baby name was Henry, and it would be for a while. They had their second baby sometime in the next 5 years, because that's the first time we hear about him. We don't actually know when he was born, but 5 years later, he was there. So in the next 5 years, he was born, and it was another little boy named Arthur. More pandering. He was probably named after the future king, the king and queen's oldest son, 13-year-old Prince Arthur. It was then that Perkin Warbeck impersonated Edward IV's presumed dead son, Richard, one of the princes in the tower, the youngest brother of the Queen. And in 1499, the whole drama repeated itself. Warbeck hung out at court for a little while, but eventually was sent to be imprisoned in the tower. The Queen decided that this man was not her brother. Warbeck was put in the tower, though, with Margaret's brother Edward, implying that they may have had some doubt. Or at the very least, they thought the people had some doubt. If the people believed it was the son of Edward IV, he would be the true king. Henry VII had made Edward's children legitimate again in order to marry Elizabeth. So that would also include her brothers, who, if alive, would have a much better claim to the throne than Henry Tudor. Executing him could erase all of the goodwill that King Henry had gained by marrying the same king's oldest daughter. This is how we know the princes in the tower were no longer there. If they had been, Henry would have pulled them out and put them on display, just like he had with Edward. But he didn't. There have been historians who claim that Edward, Margaret's brother, was mentally disabled. Likely, that was because he had been in prison since he was 10 years old. He had very little interaction with other people. He still acted like a child. He hadn't experienced the same milestones that your average noble would have experienced by 24. He was 24, but a very young 24. And compared with the well-traveled Warbeck who knew enough to impersonate a prince, he would have seemed not as fully matured. It was said that the two tried to escape the tower. If this is true, it would likely have been Warbeck's idea. Edward had been in prison for over half his life, and as far as we know, he never tried to escape. Or it was a setup to get rid of potentially problematic rivals for the throne. They could have been set up to escape, or the entire thing could have been fabricated. Henry cared far more about people's perceived reality than he did about actual reality. Henry just wanted to look good and keep his throne. Margaret's brother Edward was executed along with Warbeck. Traitor number 3 in Margaret's life, her brother Edward, though likely innocent of the charges. So much for a gentler world. They did not get the Simnel treatment. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at Long Live the Queen Podcast. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye.